As we stand here today, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before, political elite warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tension between nuclear powers. Perhaps it is because they are confident that they will have access to nuclear shelters for themselves and for their families that regular people won't have access to. So, it's up to us, the people, to speak up and demand an end to this madness. Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence. June 11, 2025. Who are these political elite warmongers that are carelessly fomenting fear and tension between nuclear powers? You know how it is. Rich people just love wiping out civilization. It is what rich people live for. And that is why we need socialism, so we can eat the rich and be done with them. But seriously, Tulsi Gabbard is a demagogue ready to blame nuclear war on some imaginary bunch of rich people, appealing to envy and resentment. Meanwhile, our domestic socialists are ready to burn the country down because they had their heads filled with Marxist sewage in school. What idiot believes that elite Americans are threatening the world with nuclear war? But then, Tulsi Gabbard is part of the political elite, and she most certainly has a bomb shelter. Or did I miss something? But wait. Tulsi Gabbard is also America's Director of National Intelligence. Does her rhetoric belong to America and NATO, or does it belong to the socialist camp? What on earth just came out of her mouth? Of course, the world is getting closer to nuclear war. But rich people are not the ones proliferating nuclear weapons. It is Russia that has enabled North Korea and Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. And now it appears that Israel may be about to strike Iran preemptively to stop Iran from building a large nuclear arsenal. Obviously, the situation has grown from bad to worse. There are evacuations of non-essential U.S. personnel in Iran, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The UK Maritime Trade Operations, a British maritime security agency, has recently issued a warning for ships transiting the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz. We're maybe days or hours away. Nuclear talks between the US and Iran have stalled, even as the talks between Ukraine and Russia go nowhere. Tensions are rising as the Russians continue to threaten NATO by forward deploying nuclear and conventional weapons. While Russia denies it is a threat to NATO, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov says that NATO should have been dissolved when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. The Russians are aggrieved that the United States did not leave Europe to them. They are entitled to own it, right? Here is a question nobody is thinking over. Why has Russia embarked on this course of war? An interesting document has appeared from the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, ROSR, published in New York on June 5, 2025. It is a statement by the Synod of Bishops on the renewal of 20th-century ideologies in Russia. Perhaps the bishops are afraid to use the word communism in this context, since we are supposed to feel ashamed for using such a word. Even though communists are taking over Latin America, we do not want to speak of a communist threat. We do not want to say that the riots in LA, which have metastasized to upwards of 1,500 demonstrations, were organized by communists. We do not like saying that China is ruled by communists, or that Putin is a communist who pretends to be a Christian. We just do not like to admit that communism is a problem, since somebody might think we sound stupid. It is a career-ending thing, after all, to warn people about communism. But here we are, after everyone has denied the obvious, reading this surreal statement of the Synod of Russian Orthodox bishops, who united with the Moscow Patriarchate in 2007, hinting that communism is returning to Russia. The Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia finds it necessary to raise its voice out of bitter necessity, for we find that in a time of crisis and growing confrontation amongst nations, aspects of the Russian state and society are wandering onto an extremely dangerous path. Instead of the promulgation of Christian repentance and purification, we observe in certain circles a return to a false, God-opposing ideology that prevailed in the last century. This return is fraught with harmful consequences. Should it continue, we fear that modern Russia risks being considered a dark stain amongst the nations, marked by a revival of spiritual corruption, instead of her being a radiant beacon of Orthodox truth, which is surely the calling to which her long history of Christian piety directs her. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia official website. There is, in Russia, among certain circles, a return to a false, God-opposing ideology that prevailed in the last century. This old ideology, i.e., communism, is beginning to take hold in Russia once again, and the Moscow Patriarchate has issued a shocking concept document that attempts to paper over the crimes of the communists against countless Christian martyrs. Why would the Moscow Patriarchate do this? The Synod of Bishops calls this a silencing and distortion of history, which it most certainly is. According to the Synod of Bishops, an example of the character of this new activity was revealed when, in the mass media, a well-known professor, respected by many in Russia, recently stated that it was Tsar Nicholas II who in fact destroyed and ruined Russia, who even led it into war. Such may be this individual's personal opinion, wholly echoing the Bolshevik propaganda of the early 20th century. But to those who know how the Ekaterinburg murder unfolded, this man's words about the Tsar, "I would have shot him myself," sound ominous indeed. Yet this project of dismissing the spiritual renewal and truths gained through the Church's glorification of the new martyrs and confessors, returning instead to the lies of a past age, is becoming more and more frequent. We regret that despite the conclusions of the Commission concerning the authenticity of the relics of the royal family and their faithful servants, the Moscow Patriarchate has still not been able to come to a clear determination on this question. Do not hold your breath. The Moscow Patriarchate is under the control of Putin's KGB friends. There is not going to be a clear determination on this question. Stalin is to be glorified, not God. The great murderer's image has been put up in Moscow and in Volgograd. Why? Because communism was never eradicated in Russia. It went underground so that the West would disarm. And now it may be too late for the West to rearm. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte made a rather frightening statement earlier this month. Rutte warned that if NATO members do not commit to higher defense spending, then it is time to get your Russian language course out or go to New Zealand. The only problem with going to New Zealand, of course, is that you will have to get out your Chinese language course. Russian President Vladimir Putin does not want peace, and President Trump keeps saying he will put sanctions on Russia in 2 weeks. But several weeks have now elapsed, and Trump does nothing. Perhaps references to the sale of one of Jeffrey Epstein's old black books is having an effect. A communist from Vermont, Christopher Helali, bought one of the convicted pedophile's infamous address books for $425 off eBay in 2020 from a woman who found it on a Manhattan sidewalk. Helali hopes to sell it at auction for $50,000. Better not put sanctions on Russia, Donald. This little address book might have your phone number in it. You ought to be careful, since the next item sold at auction might be a video recording. Watch for more blackmail hints. The heat is being turned up. The time has come to abandon Ukraine. Even better, abandon NATO. Meanwhile, we ought to ask whether war in the Middle East might be followed by an expansion of the war in Eastern Europe, then followed by a war in the Far East. What do you think? Am I one of those political elite warmongers whose rhetoric is calculated to raise tensions? Tulsi says it is up to us to stop the madness. And it is very simple. We let the Russians and Chinese take over the world, and we learn Russian or Chinese. Of course, PLA General Chi Haoyan says the plan is to exterminate all the Americans. And our deaths would be for a very good cause. We will have prevented a nuclear war. Right, Tulsi?